Hello, my name is Dirk Yarker, and I'm professor for this Western civilization from 1660 to the present. Hopefully these past few weeks have been working out all right. I know there's been some technical issues in the past, and occasionally with the weather, even my internet goes out, so it makes it a little difficult to get some of the content up in time. But nevertheless, hopefully these videos will come up in time so we can address it each week. I'm planning on weekly videos, so we'll just try to see how this works out. Nevertheless, what I wanted to provide so far is I believe I've answered most of the questions that were posed so far on Blackboard. I'll be trying to keep up to date on those. As far as myself is concerned, just as a general introductory, which should have occurred long before now. But yes, I went to school at Western Illinois University, got my bachelor's there, and then my master's, both in history. My general specialization is European history, but typically it is ancient history, so ancient Greek, ancient Rome, and there's also interest in the ancient Middle East, and how all those cultures interact with one another. Generally, I do military and social history. And I've been teaching for 2 years now, both at Lincoln Land, but also at another college in Iowa, Burlington, Iowa, and the college is Southeastern Community College. So that's what I've been doing. I also did a study abroad in Greece, which was fantastic, especially if you're interested in ancient sites like I am. We spent 3 weeks there, and if you ever get a chance to study abroad, certainly go ahead and do that. Unfortunately, a lot of those images probably won't be shown in this class. I might be able to cipher through some of them to address some of the concerns when we talk about the Ottoman Empire, and then, of course, the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans did have territories in Greece at one time, so I might be able to incorporate some of that when we get there. Of course, that'll be in the content. I'll make you all aware of that in the announcements. Now, as for the overview for this past chapter we did in week 1, or actually technically week 2, is absolutism. What I first want to address is just kind of make sure that everyone is aware. I'm sure you've probably read about it, but absolutism is generally the idea and the theory that one individual is going to have all the power. They're going to have the power to make laws, to raise armies, command those armies, tell them who to invade, and also, of course, the ruler is going to be able to generally be able to do whatever he wants. And in this case, it is men in control. So you have King Louis, we have situations like Peter the Great in Russia, Frederick William in Prussia. These are all men. Now, there are women in this period of history who are queens or influential monarchs, but as far as absolutism is concerned, we're going to be looking at men, of course. But we'll certainly get to women and their contribution, certainly in the later chapters. But as far as rulers are concerned, as we said, absolutism is about one person in control of the entire state, every single avenue of government, and political intervention. So, keeping that in mind, we look at a few examples. Now, the theories were posed by Thomas Hobbes primarily on how states should be run, and some of these ideas were proposed because of the situation in Europe. There was a lot of rebellion going on. There was the religious wars. The 30 Years' War was a primary example. There's a lot of religious conflict going on at this period of time. And so, because of all this chaos, Thomas Hobbes believed that maybe one person in power might be able to organize and create peace and stability in Europe. And part of this is probably came about due to the readings of Rome. Most of the education at this period of time was reading the ancient Greek and Roman classics. So they're going to be exposed to Roman senators and Roman emperors. And so they understood that the Roman Empire had a period of quite a bit of stability when they were in power, certainly with the emperors, and the emperors were in charge of a lot of power. So this idea probably was proposed a little bit by that exposure. So these are the theories. And his theory of absolutism takes into account a few tactics. One of these tactics is to remove the national assemblies, and in part limit the national assemblies. These national assemblies can be parliament, for example, in England, also parliament or a states general, depending on what period of time you're talking about, in France. Something that we have that's a national assembly here in the United States is going to be the United States Congress. So something along those lines. So limit the power of those. Also to garner the support and the loyalty of the nobles or the wealthy class citizens in that said country. And then finally, being able to control or manipulate the administrative government to enact your sort of policies. So if you take those three strategies of the theory, then you look at how, for example, England and France put those into place, we can kind of gauge how effective absolutism was in Europe. So, for example, King Louis, the 13th and then 14th, some of these policies are obviously going to transcend into other rulers, and that's certainly going to be the case in France. So, for example, he had to limit the power of the national assemblies to gain complete control over the state, or at least more control than he already had. Part of this process was in part with the Versailles Palace, which is probably more famous, for example, in recent times with the area that the World War I peace agreement is going to be formed. But back in the day, this was a palace for King Louis, and he is, of course, going to live in this palace. And how he limits their control, in a sense, on both the nobles as well as the parliament, is he is going to require them to come to Versailles and, of course, prostrate themselves, meaning bowing before him. And then he's going to give them certain titles in order for their loyalty. So there's going to be some sort of ritual in place where they're going to have to participate in this process. And so if they want to be heard, if they want to participate in the government, they want to be honored and, of course, increase their status in society, they're going to have to be at the Versailles Palace. And in some cases, King Louis is going to request them at the palace. But if they're at the palace, they're not going to be meddling in other affairs. So this is going to be a sense of control for King Louis. He's going to make sure that they're not manipulating or trying to assassinate him, for example, because they're going to be in his palace. And so, looking into that, with this palace, this is a really big control scheme. And in a sense, if you have control and they want favor, and if you want to do anything in the French government, you're going to have to get the favor of King Louis. So he's going to give them titles and some riches, basically in a way distract them from the political system. But he's still going to take in consideration what they say. And so if he makes it look like he's thinking over what they've said, they think they have some sort of control in the French government. Of course, some ideas he's going to take and some ideas he's not. But it keeps them busy, it keeps them viewed as valued in society. That's going to be one way he's going to get the loyalty and control over the nobles and the wealthy individuals. And so, in that sense, he's already getting back to that absolutism state where he's going to have control. So he's going to have control over them, but also he's going to hire these people called intendants. And these guys are officials that are not from the noble families who are going to be hired by King Louis. And these officials are going to basically oversee the running of the day-to-day affairs and become part of his council, which will also be separated into departments. Departments like labor, war, commerce. A lot of these titles are fairly familiar in our own governments here today. For example, the United States has much of these titles. Some of these titles are changed, like the Department of Defense instead of Department of War, but more or less the same sort of style. So these are going to be the guys who are going to be running the state, and they're going to have their loyalty geared towards King Louis. And so these are guys who don't have positions of power. They don't rely on their families. They're going to be based on merit and how they can run their own department. So that's going to bring more power in with King Louis. So in a way, this is going to be how he gains all the power of the absolute state. Everything is going to be based on merit. You're not going to have the royalty or the nobles really having power over making laws. This is all going to be influenced by King Louis. And so King Louis actually obtains an absolutist state. If you look back on the definition of absolutism, one person in complete power, well, King Louis does have all power. He can make laws. He has loyalty of the nobles because they're seeking his favor for titles and wealth and favors. And he also has control of the military. And of course, he goes through a whole series of wars, which you can read about in the textbook. I don't really want to rehash a lot of what was actually stated in the textbook, because you can read it for yourself. This is more about a conversation, because all the information is out there. You've already read it, so I'm not going to rehash what war and what happened and who won and all that other good stuff. But in the course of the absolute state, he does get a really wealthy state, but through these wars, he's going to bankrupt France, and they're going to be completely surrounded by enemies. Because this is going to be the period of time where balance of power is going to be put into place. One great power comes alive in Europe, and then the rest of the powers, like Russia and England and the Dutch and the Netherlands, are going to, of course, come back and try to limit the power of that said power. In this case, it's going to be France. In later cases, for example, it'll be Germany, World War I, World War II, that sort of scenario. So, in the end, they're going to have a bankrupt state, but the king and the monarch is certainly going to be in a powerful position. They do have an absolute state. King Louis is not going to leave the state in a very good position, but they do actually achieve an absolute state. So try to keep that in mind. Now, I could go over some of the other countries and states in Europe, but I don't want to make this video to be an hour and a half long or anything like that. Aiming for maybe a 20-minute video. We'll just kind of see what happens. But the other state, as a stark contradiction, is going to be England, that I'll start to talk about. Now, England, on the other hand, keeping in mind what absolutism is, they have a monarch, and you have a parliament. The parliament is, of course, going to be the National Assembly. Now, King James I of England, so we'll refer to that title because he's also the King of Scotland, and he's going to be the sixth one there. But to avoid any sort of confusion, we'll just call him by the English monarchy name of King James I. Now, he's not going to have too long of a rule, and he's not going to shake things up too much for England. But what he does start to do, since he is Catholic, he is going to try institute a more tolerant Catholic state, which makes a lot of the Englishmen very nervous because it's a Protestant state. Since before him, Queen Elizabeth, you also have Henry VIII had brought Protestantism to England. So they got a little bit nervous. But also James I is going to bring about this idea of divine right, and that he is responsible to God, and he got his power of monarchy through God, and he doesn't have to listen to anybody else. That, of course, is not going to fly with Parliament. So basically the relationship between Parliament and James I is very tense, but they're going to keep the peace, which is all well and good. But then we have Charles I, which is going to be the son of James, and this is going to be where they start instituting new laws. So what they require is Charles I to sign a decree saying that Parliament has the power to levy taxes, and if he wants taxes, he's going to have to come to Parliament to figure that out, and all of those relations. But the next year, Charles I doesn't want to play ball, and so he doesn't call Parliament for quite some time, until 1640. And so during that time, he's going to institute a bunch of taxes without the consent of Parliament, and he's going to institute these taxes, for example, for other purposes. One example is he is going to tax coastal cities for funding, at least he's going to mark it as funding for defense against foreign powers by the sea. But he's going to use those funds for other purposes, like buying new clothing, building projects throughout England, new cathedrals, new estates, that sort of thing. So it's not exactly truthful. But eventually, there's going to be a revolt in Scotland, and this is going to be based on Charles I trying to put Anglican Church into Scotland and convert the population to that sort of line of thinking. They don't care for it, and so they revolt. And now he needs an army, and armies are expensive, which you've probably read about, and you're probably fully aware of it even today. Armies are still expensive, and so he needs money. And so he needs to call on Parliament for money. And so part of the agreement to getting that money, which he does, they raise the money, they employ an army, and they defeat the Scottish and the Irish. And so what's going to occur after that is all of those taxes that Charles put into place without Parliament are going to be abolished. And it's required that Parliament will meet every 3 years, even without monarch like Charles I decrees it. So no matter what, they're going to meet for 3 years, whether Charles likes it or not. So that's put into place. And that's all well and good. But Charles, after this disagreement, for example, there's going to be the start of an English Civil War. Basically, Charles agrees to all of these terms, but then Parliament wants to go a little bit further by removing the bishops in some of the churches that Charles I appointed. And with this bickering in Parliament, because some of the people didn't really want to go about doing that, they thought it was a little bit too far, some people didn't think it was far enough, and so in the end, Charles I is going to arrest the radical ones, the ones who want to remove the bishops. And this pisses Parliament off. So, Parliament, some members of Parliament, John Prim, as well as Oliver Cromwell, and the Puritans are going to oppose Charles I. They view that he has overstepped his bounds, he has not gone through with all of his agreements, and therefore a civil war starts. And through the Civil War, you're going to get Oliver Cromwell rising to power. He's going to be a military guy, and he's going to be very good at it. But also through this period, you see the formation of the Model Army. New Model Army is the complete name. And this is going to be the first professional British army. This is going to be where it gets its start. Previous to this point, English troops were conscripted, or there were lords and nobles who had agreed to go to war. Now you get full-time soldiers fighting full-time. They didn't just go home after a war or after a period of months to go back to their farms. This is going to be a full-time military, much like what many of the states have today, and certainly are starting to get in this period of time. With this army, they're able to defeat the royal forces of Charles, and through the bickering after the peace treaty, Charles I is going to be able to escape. He does. They recapture him once again, and Oliver Cromwell's in power at this point, and so he decides to remove Parliament that opposes him. So these are non-Puritans, Presbyterian folk, and so they remove them from Parliament, and as a result, he is going to try Charles as treasonous. And then he is going to be beheaded publicly, and it's going to be a really fantastic affair. They're going to behead him in public. He's going to be selling tickets for a public viewing of this beheading. It's really a public affair. Probably rather gruesome by our standards, but this is how things went. So after the beheading, his son, Charles II, is going to flee for obvious reasons. He wants to keep his head. So, after this point, Oliver Cromwell is going to be in complete power of England. And through his power, he's going to try to get along with Parliament, but he's getting used to being in power, and he doesn't want to let that power go away. But he's also a very religious figure, and he believes he's doing much of his work in the name of God. And so, as a result, with disagreements with other parliamentary figures, he's going to imprison them. Some people are going to be executed, removed. A lot of them are going to flee. A lot of this is also told in your book, so I'm not going to rehash a lot of these different events, because my job is to put it all in context. So, in the end, he's going to form his own government by himself. He's going to rule with 11 different districts in England, separated by himself, and they're going to be ruled by military governors, and of course, they're going to be in power. This is going to last until his death. Then after his death, we see Parliament reforming, and this entire system dissolving, and they're going to call on Charles II to come back and be their king, and he agrees to do so. They return the government back to the period before this entire civil war started. So we have a parliament with a House of Commons, a House of Lords, and you have a monarchy, and everything's all well and good. And everyone thinks this entire horrific nightmare affair of the English Civil War is over. But, of course, as we all know, it's never the end. So we come back to the situation where Charles II is going to have a son, James II. And they follow through with, it's fairly peaceful for the most part, but James II is going to be Catholic. And it's very well known that he's going to be Catholic. And of course, the English are going to have a problem with this since they're primarily Protestant. So this is a whole religious affair. So with this disagreement, some sectors of Parliament agree that maybe they should keep James II as the next ruler, not to mess with it, and some people don't want James II, and they want to call on maybe a Protestant ruler over in Europe and bring him over. In the end, they're going to keep James II, and so James II comes into power. James II is Catholic, and so he starts appointing people to power, for example, in military positions, in the church officials, as well as civil positions as well. And they're not really going to mess around with it too much because they believe that he's on his last leg. Maybe they'll deal with it for a few years, maybe he'll die, and then they'll move on to the next issue. But then he has a son, which he pronounces is going to be baptized in the Catholic faith, and he's going to be a Catholic king. So that draws concern for a lot of English people. So this is going to be the point where the nobles are going to go over to the Netherlands and talk with William of Orange, which is actually the husband of Mary. And Mary is the daughter of James II. And she's Protestant, openly Protestant. So they're okay with this. Now, William of Orange is going to be offered the monarchy. So this is all well and good for him because he's the king of the Netherlands, and now he's going to be king in England. And since he's at war with France, he's looking at England as maybe a bastion of hope that's going to get a lot of resources and a lot of manpower to help defeat, of course, France. So he's completely okay with this. He raises an army, and he travels over to England, and it's completely a bloodless revolution. They actually call this the Glorious Revolution, in part because there is no bloodshed, but also in part because this returns England to a monarchical system. So, what's actually going to occur when William comes into power is you have a series of acts being passed. Some of these acts, for example, one is going to be the Bill of Rights, giving people the right to bear arms, giving the right for free speech and free debate, also jury by your peers, so they don't have to be judged by, say, nobles or the king, for example. When they go to jail, they're not going to have excessive costs, so that's all well and good. Because you can imagine if you stole a loaf of bread and now you owe $50,000, that's a little excessive. But this is how some of the monarchies were able to get some money. Just accuse a noble of stealing or doing something wrong, and of course they're going to pay $50,000, dollars or pounds, however way you want to look at it. So they don't have to do that. And so the citizens themselves are going to get a whole lot more rights. Parliament itself is going to have the power to levy taxes, which is nothing new. They're also going to have the power to free and open debate, so they don't have to worry about being arrested in a debate against some sort of policy or law. So that's all well and good. They also have the power to consent to an army. So the monarch himself does not have the power to raise an army. It's going to be through Parliament. Very much like the system we have today, for example. In the United States Congress, you're supposed to ask them to go to war, and most presidents do. But the official declaration of war hasn't been done since World War II. But this is a system that's been in use for quite some time, since this period of time. So, That's the kind of power that Parliament has. So if you look at the stark contrast, if you look at absolutism once again, and of course the definition is going to be one person in complete power of this entire state, you don't get that in England. You have shared power. You have the monarchy, who's the figurehead. He's going to be an executive power, while Parliament is the legislative power and is going to be able to pass laws, make laws, and provide the funding and such for the state. And so you do not get an absolute power in this position. And the English are going to solve this religious dispute problem by allowing toleration for both Puritans as well as Protestants. Catholics, not immediately. The English still, at this period, don't care for Catholics. And so through that, eventually you are going to get Catholics being tolerant. But this is essentially going to end persecution and religious persecution in England from this time onward. So we're talking 1688 onward is going to be the end of this entire religious persecution. And so if you look at the events of England, Jamestown was established in 1609 in America. A lot of Puritans and other individuals coming over to North America and recognizing what's going on in England at this time, you can probably understand why this is going on. A lot of persecution on both sides. At one time, the Puritans were persecuted. At one time, Protestants. One time, Catholics. So it's constantly changing. But they're going to put an end to all of this fairly soon, in 1688. Taking that into account, you see two of these absolutist states, and how, or these two states, and how one is absolutism and one is not. Basically, King Louis was able to make an absolutist state by working within the system, working within the confines of what already existed, and trying to apply that to gain more power and expand royal authority. And he's successful at doing this. Other rulers are going to do exactly the same sort of thing. Look at Prussia, look at Russia, these sort of things, they work within the system. If you want to look further ahead to a more modern example, Adolf Hitler. He worked in the democratic system, become the chancellor in Germany, and become the dictator of Germany. And then, of course, we have World War II coming shortly after that. So just another example. Looking at this, what I'd like you to bring about from this absolutism era is what absolutism is, how the states address it, what are these tactics that were forwarded by Thomas Hobbes, which I listed at the beginning of the video, so just kind of review, can go right back to the video. So what is absolutism? What were the tactics or strategies proposed by Thomas Hobbes, and how did these states use those tactics and strategies? And I outlined very quickly what many of these different tactics and what they did and how successful it was. Both of these scenarios, they worked differently based on the population and what the political sentiment of these groups of people were at this time. They are different, and they take different avenues of how to accomplish some of these actions. In England, it's a failure. In France, it's a success, for better or for worse. So keep that in mind. Now, as far as the historical significance of absolutism, basically the absolutist state becomes the norm in Europe. France is an absolutist state, Prussia is an absolutist state, Russia is an absolutist state. These are the big ones off the bat. And so this is going to form much of how states are going to be run from this period of time onward. Now, of course, the next chapter is going to be on scientific revolution, and we're going to address political elements later on in another couple chapters. We're going to have to look at some of these other instances, social and other revolutionary aspects. But what you can see is the borders are going to be solidified, how people are running their governments is more of an absolutist state, in part because of the situations arising at this period of time. The grand all historical significance of absolutism is you have the formation of the modern states of England, of France, and of Germany, which, of course, in this period of time is called Prussia, and then finally Russia. This is going to, of course, define how Europe is formed. Eventually, of course, these governments are going to change as time goes on, but these are going to be the formations of the modern states that we know of today. The governments will change, but the bottom, the foundation of Europe is going to be established during this time with these absolutist states. And of course, we have an anomaly of England establishing a constitutional monarchy. But of course, it's going to completely shape how Europe develops politically and how power is disseminated throughout Europe. Hopefully that wasn't too boring. Hopefully I got a message across, something clear of what I'm looking for you to get out of this chapter. Certainly there's more topics which you answered on Blackboard, but hopefully I'll be doing these every week. Hopefully it's not going to be 30 minutes every single time either, but we'll work on that. Hope everyone's having a great week. Take care. I'll see you next week.